Hello, beautiful people, and welcome. Hi, to the fourth video in the series of Witchcrafting videos, where I go through all the characters that are getting buffed next patch, and it's now Mona's turn. Now, I finally got a boom arm for my mic, so hopefully the sound quality is a bit better now. Let me know in the comments, actually, how the sound quality is now. But anyways, if you look at Mona's current place in the meta, she's not really used effectively anywhere. You can use her with Skirk, because Skirk last slot options tend to not be that good, and she fulfills the basic requirement of being Hydro or Cryo, while being a catalyst that can use CTDS and also does something that isn't completely worthless. But she doesn't do that much there. Outside of Skirk teams, you don't really see Mona anywhere, because Mona's burst only lasts for 5 seconds. And it's pretty much the only thing her kit does. Her burst only lasting for 5 seconds, and as a quick reminder for people that forgot what Mona does, which is understandable, honestly. Her burst applies a debuff onto enemies, and that debuff is effectively, like, it's not really a debuff, it's just damage percent for you. And it's 60 damage percent at talent level 10. 60 damage percent is pretty good, right? That's generally more than what Farina Fanfare gives you on average. But it's not insane. Like, Farina generally gets almost that on average, but also has a bit of personal damage. Mona doesn't have that personal damage. And on top of that, there's a bunch of teams where she struggles to get her energy back. Mona's Constellations actually matter because she's a standard character, right? She's the only standard 5-star out of the witches that are receiving buffs. So the impact of her Constellations matter a good amount. Her C1 gives you reaction damage bonus, but because of the short duration from Mona's burst, generally, if you are using her burst as part of a setup, if you need to then also remove the Hydro Aura and apply something else and then swap to a carry, the burst is over. And so she doesn't tend to work for anyone that isn't a Pyro carry. And even for Pyro carries, most of them have uptime that's long enough that a good portion of their damage will just not be buffed by her burst. So it just isn't that good. It technically also buffs some other reactions. It buffs Lunar Charge, Electro Charge, Hydro Swirl. It doesn't actually buff Frozen Duration. It's been bugged since 1.0. They still haven't fixed it. And I don't think, as far as I've heard, they haven't fixed it with the buff. So I mean, this is just a lie, but whatever. The Lunar Charge damage increase can be okay for Flynn's, or I guess for Inefa, but the big problem here is that 15 isn't a lot, because those teams generally tend to end up with a lot of EM or direct EM multiplier buffs through the Ascendant Gleam effect, through Flynn's Ascension passive that gives you 20, the Prospector's Shovel is 48, then all the EM buffs, right? Inefa gives EM, Flynn's gets EM, the set bonus gives EM and EM multiplier. So you end up really saturated on reaction damage bonus, and because it's 15 for everything instead of a like balanced amount for each reaction, the same way that if you look at the TF set, for example, it gives a different amount of damage for each reaction type. It gives more to Hyper Bloom than it does to Aggravate. If you look at Crimson Witch as well, right? It gives 40 to Overload transformative reactions, but it gives 15 to Vape and Melt. And the fact that Mona's C1 doesn't, and is just a 15 across the board, means that it's a lot less valuable outside of Vape teams. But we've already said, with Vape teams, it's only really for the Pyro carries, and there isn't really a Pyro carry that has field time short enough for Mona's burst to buff everything. And the C2 doesn't do anything. C4 gives crit to enemies affected by Omen, but it has the same problem of Omen just not lasting for long enough. Well, the buffs are very big, and the most important buff to Mona is they have given her an ability to extend Omen duration other than the weird freeze bullshit. All right, we're not going to talk about freeze Omen extension. Basically, the timer for the Omen starts when the bubble explodes, and if you keep enemies frozen, the bubble doesn't explode until they get unfrozen. So you can extend your duration with that, but we're not going to talk about that for now. So, as a reminder, the way that the witch buffs work is some characters are getting direct buffs to their kit in general, but the main thing is these characters are getting new passives that are reliant on having 2 witches on your team. So you need to have 2 witches, you can't only have 1 to get these passives. And the most important buff to Mona is only for 2 witches. Now, you might have noticed the characters that are receiving witch buffs. If we filter by Hydro and Cryo, there's only Mona. That means Skirk teams cannot gain any value from this Mona buff. So, when you have 2 witches on your team, Mona gets the following passive. When Mona's normal or charge attacks hit an opponent, she gains 1 stack of Astral Glow Mercy. When other party members trigger Vape, it consumes stacks to increase the damage. This passive is kind of worthless. It gives you up to 15 reaction damage. Basically the same thing as her C1 right now. Only if you on-field her. It's fine, but it's like, meh. It doesn't tend to be impactful unless you on-field her, and even if you do, it's not that big of a deal. Additionally, and this is the part that matters, when Mona's normal or charge attacks hit an opponent, the enemy's Omen duration is extended by 2 seconds. This effect can trigger at most once every 0.5 seconds. It can extend the Omen by up to 8 seconds, which means this 5 seconds duration is now going up to 13. Now, you do need to do 4 normal attacks, which is going to take you about like 1 to 2 seconds. So it's not actually +8. It's like plus... I'm not saying it. It's like +6-ish, because you do lose this like 2-ish seconds doing the normals. But as it turns out, like 11-ish is a lot more than 5, which adds a lot of teams where Mona just provides a lot more. But that's not all. They're also buffing pretty much all of her constellations. First is the buff to the C1. This 15% reaction damage that you get is increased to 24 instead for off-field party members. So if you're using Mona as a driver for like off-field carry Durin, for example, you get a bit more value from her C1. But her best teams don't tend to have her on field for too long, so this isn't really that big of a deal. C2, right? The C2 right now is when you do a normal attack, there's a 20% chance that you get a coordinated charge attack with it. It's pretty worthless. Now, the first normal attack you do after burst is guaranteed to proc this, which is alright, but it doesn't do that much by itself. But also, when Mona's charge attack hits an opponent, all nearby party members will have their EM increased by 80. So her C2 now gives an 80 EM team-wide party buff on top of what it did before. C4, when any party member attacks an opponent affected by Omen, crit rate increased by 15, that's what it already was. But if you're using a witch, they also get 15 crit damage. Now, this doesn't apply to non-witches, but it will mean that when you're using Mona with Fischl, with Durin, they get a little bit more value from the C4. That being said, though, the biggest buff to the C4 is not the direct one. It's the fact that Omen lasting long enough means that you get actual uptime on this 15 crit rate. That's the part that actually matters. And it's actually a pretty big deal. Finally, we have C6. I'm not going to talk too much about the C6 changes, but right now her C6 is when you spend time in her dash, in her enhanced dash, you charge up stacks 1 per second, and each stack increases the damage of her next charge attack by 60%, up to 180. But spending time waiting and looking at enemies during dash is bad, so it's completely worthless. They're making it so that you also generate stacks if there is an enemy affected by Omen without needing to dash. So you actually get to use the C6 for carry Mona if you want to. They're also doubling Mona's charge attack damage. This, paired with all of the other effects, mean that carry Mona is an actual real thing now. But as much as it's technically something that you will be able to do if you have C6 Mona, from what I've looked at, it isn't better than using a character like Mualani. And I mean, if you've followed this channel at all, you'll know how unpleasant I find the gameplay experience of Mualani to be. With Mona, it'll be worse. Way worse. You can't accidentally dash when you're too close to enemies because that makes you lose vapes because her dash applies hydro. Can't do too many normal attacks. Charge attack focused gameplay on a character that has 50 stamina cost on charge attacks and no way to reduce their stamina cost. Gotta jump cancel that shit. Good luck not getting staggered during your jumps. From what I've looked at, the best team for forward vape Mona is is using Guoba as your off-field Pyro. Listen, it's not gonna be fun. If you really like Mona, she will actually be a playable carry, but if you're just looking at meta-focused stuff, do not do that to yourself. Anyways, getting back to the stuff that actually matters, so carry Mona aside. And if we look at the other witches, so the carries, so Razor, Klee, they don't benefit from Mona that much because Razor isn't really a reaction-focused carry. And while Klee is technically Pyro, with the buffs, they're increasing her Pyro application. So I don't really expect there to be too much you can do for Vape Mona. And then Venti carry is like, it's not that good anyways. So it mainly leaves you with Durin, Albedo, Surgos, and Fischl as potential teammates to Mona. What does Mona provide that carries might want? Well, if you look at electro carries, or you look at someone like Varessa, for example. Varessa doesn't benefit from the reaction buffs that Mona gives, so it would only be the damage percent and maybe the crit value. But Varessa can already use Farina, and Farina isn't that good with Varessa to begin with. Mona with worse uptime buffs is not gonna be that good either. And it's kind of similar for most of the electro carries. The prevalence of Chevaliers in the meta kind of makes it so you don't really care too much about the Mona buffs for your electro carries. Flynn's is actually gonna like Mona, right? Flynn's benefits from the reaction bonus. He benefits from EM. He benefits from crit. He doesn't care about the damage percent Mona gives, but the Hydro slot right now for Flynn's team is bad. You're using, I know. The Flynn's team I've calced the highest so far with the witch buffs has been Flynn's, Inefa, Durin, Mona. I need to see some proper footage of it to be sure that reactions work the way I expect them to. But if they do, it'll be like a little bit better than the current teams that use Sucrose, I know. Anyways, for Dendro carries, they do care about EM, about damage percent, and about crit, if you're looking at someone like Alhaitham, for example. But they don't have a support that you actively want to use that's another witch. You can use Albedo, I guess, but it's like, ugh. You can use Fischl, but Fischl is unlikely to get the electro charge that you would need with just Mona's application to buff EM. So you're basically playing a character that by herself doesn't do that much in your quicken teams. It's gonna work. It's gonna be one of your options, but I don't really see it being all that much better than the other things you'll be able to do with like Llama and stuff like that. You also don't get any value from Mona C1 because the reactions your Dendro characters are triggering are not Hydro reactions. Other than that, you have the other type of Dendro carries, right? You have Kinich. Kinich also just doesn't get any value from anything other than the damage percent and the crit. And there's just other options for Kinich. On top of that, the Hydro app is actually going to be harmful for Kinich because Burgeon isn't as good at filling up his Night Soul as Burning is. And then on top of that, Mona's Hydro application isn't very fast, so you might not even get Burgeon at all. Then you have the Cryo carries. Cryo carries don't benefit from the Mona buffs, right? There's Kirk. We already said you don't get the Witch bonus. Geo carries can use her, just like they can use Farina, but right now the power of the Geo carries is pretty low, which means that you're not too happy using her. Probably better off just using off-fielders that deal damage and pretending your Geo carry doesn't suck. Anemo carries, they're in a similar boat. And that leaves us with Pyro and Hydro carries. Pyro carries as a whole are basically getting Mona as one of their options, but there isn't really any Pyro carry that is now going to have Mona as their best in slot by a decent margin, other than Durin. And even then, it's only best in slot by a noticeable margin if you have Constellations on Mona. And this is probably the most annoying thing about the whole Mona buffs, is that because Mona is a standard character, you can get her from the selector every anniversary. You can lose your 50/50s to her. You can get her from the Constellation selector one time. It is actually realistic to assume that people might have a bunch of cons on her. But the thing is, there is a very large discrepancy between the performance of Mona C0 versus Mona C4 in a lot of these teams. Often, the team DPS can change by up to like 25 to 30%. 25 to 30% is like Inefa for Flynn's. That's a big deal. And so every time I'm going to make a statement about Mona in these teams, there's always going to be the caveat of like, well, at C4, it's a lot better than at C0. Anyways, C4 Mona, I'd say, is best in slot for Durin, but C2 Mona probably isn't. Because at C2 Durin, or sorry, at C2 Mona, without the crit you get from C4, on the witch characters, it's 45, right? So it's a lot more. And so not having that for Durin matters a lot. From what I've looked at, I was actually getting better results with Fischl plus a Hydro that has enough uptime to maintain more vapes through Fischl than I was getting with Mona +1. Because Mona is not enough Hydro for Fischl unless you on-field Mona, which I guess you can do too. But I mean, I'll talk about this more in the Durin video. Durin's best carry teams are on-field Durin because Bennett is broken. And it's stupid and I hate it because Durin is a character who gains literally nothing from being on-field. But Bennett is so good that just having him be able to keep Bennett buff and Bennett Pyro Infusion, because he doesn't have terrible charge attacks, is enough to make his on-field teams with Bennett C6 better than the other ones. But again, that's Durin, not Mona, so we'll talk about that in the Durin video. There is one character that gets so much from the Mona buffs that I'd say they're straight up like a whole ass tier, maybe even 2 below, if you don't have Mona's C4. Let me introduce you to my favorite character, Mualani. Mualani is certainly a character of all time, and the Mona buffs are massive because there's actually a lot of teams where you do double Hydro Mualani using something like Candace, who's worthless, right? 40 damage percent at best isn't much. Just because having a second Hydro gives you Hydro Resonance, which is nice, but also more energy, so you burst every 2 rotations on Mualani instead of every 3 or 4. Having a Hydro character that generates particles, but that is also not worthless on the Mualani team, is a massive deal. On top of that, right, on top of the energy and the Hydro Resonance, you're also getting much easier swirl or crystallize setups if you use Shilonen by using a second Hydro, which allows you to not have to deal with the really cringe moments when you have to like do a charge attack and a normal attack on Mualani, so you get rid of the enemy's Pyro, and then you can actually have Hydro so you can go swirl. In these double Hydro teams, that's gone entirely. Now you might be thinking, you might be seeing this and being like, Jeff, there's no healer here. There is a healer here. You don't see the healer, but it is there. It is there. It is most definitely there. I think people often don't realize that the healing provided by Prototype Amber is not based on the holder's HP, it's based on the target's HP. What that means is that usually when you have Proto Amber on the team, on like a character like Sucrose or whatever, it doesn't tend to feel that impactful for healing because the characters you're healing don't have that much max HP, so they don't get healed by that much. Mualani is an HP scaler, and you're getting Hydro Resonance. So you do get a lot of max HP. On top of that, your support set options for Mona in this team suck ass, which means that unironically, her best set damage-wise is Song of Days Past. Because you have such bad uptime on Instructor in this team, you only get it on one of Mualani's hits, it's actually getting beat by Song of Days Past. And Song of Days Past is another 15 healing bonus. Pair that with a healing bonus circlet, you now have 50 healing bonus, which means Proto Amber is healing you for 27% of your HP per rotation on each character. And on a character like Mualani that has 4k HP, that's like 10k, and 10k is not bad. This enemy is Hydro immune, so you won't get to see the wow, oh my god damage numbers, but you will get to see the rotation. So the rotation that I came up with for this team was Mona skill, Mawika, burst skill, Mona burst, 4 normal attacks, Sucrose, E, and 1 to make sure you don't have Hydro on the enemy anymore, and then you do your 3 chomps. And when you have burst, you just burst instead of the 3rd chomp or the 2nd chomp, not on top of it, right? So you do 2 chomps plus burst or 3 chomps. These rotations have full uptime on VV, full uptime on Mona buff, not full uptime on Sucrose's EM buff. It's 2 out of 3 hits, but it's still pretty close. They've got Cinder City. You're fixing basically all of the team building problems that Mualani has in a team like this, right? If you've ever played Mualani with Shilonen, you might have noticed, oh, I can't use Shilonen's burst because it removes my Hydro and then I don't have Swirl. So I have to swap back to Mualani and then I proc Witsith, and now I've procced Witsith when I wasn't ready to start doing damage, so it'll be on cooldown by the time I swap back to her. It feels really bad. With Mona, well, you can use Mona as your healer and you get it by default in your rotation from the Proto Amber. But even if you do something like Durin Mona Shilonen instead of Mawika Mona Sucrose, because you now have a Hydro character that can apply Hydro that isn't Mualani, you're not proccing your Witsith by accident anymore. You don't have to deal with the stupid ass Mualani charge attack animation. Honestly, from what I've looked at for the calcs, this team is kind of really good. With Mona C4, I'm getting numbers on this team that are actually pretty similar to Mawika Melt. A little bit behind, but Mualani is a character that tends to scale with stat investment, right? So with artifact quality, better than pretty much anyone else, which means that I think there is an argument to be made that setting aside the insane like 7 melt combo bullshit with Mawika, like normal 4 melt Mawika stuff, there's an argument to be made that Mualani can be the best carry in a team like this. Again, keep in mind 2 things, right? 1, it's not out yet, so everything is still subject to change. And 2, I am fallible. I'm not perfect. I know it may be a surprise to some of you guys. I can make mistakes too, so keep that in mind. And also, I guess thing number 3, as much as the numbers are good, you're still playing Mualani. You still have all the potential gameplay issues that Mualani has, but the buffs to the Mualani teams with this are basically making Mualani as good as people that like Mualani think she is. Again, keep in mind, this is with C4 Mona. If you don't have C4 Mona, you lose 10k. If you don't have C2 Mona, you lose 5k. If you don't have C1 Mona, you lose another 5k. And at that point, Mona isn't even necessarily the best in slot for Mualani anymore. From what I've looked at, the teams that have a little bit less focus on Mona personal or on Mualani personal damage and a bit more on off-field damage, using Durin, using Albedo, tend to slightly outperform the Mona teams if Mona is not high Constellation. Honestly, the main takeaway from this video is that if you're a Mualani player and you don't have Mona's C4, take her from the selector, from every selector until you do. Because right now, Mona is, like, with these buffs, Mona is actually a good unit. For new players that don't have Mona, for the love of God, do not get baited into trying to get a standard character from the standard banner by spending your primos there. That being said, if you have a Mona lying around, she very well might be a worthwhile investment now. Getting her built, getting her burst to level 10. Now, if you have Constellations, you don't need to level it past 10. Right? If you have the C3, when you try to level it to level 11 or more, it stops increasing the damage bonus value, and it just increases the damage the bubble does, right? It caps at 60, so you don't need to level it any more than that. But getting yourself a Mona with burst talent level 10, getting yourself a Proto Ember for her, or I guess Fav or TTDS and some of the other teams, getting her ascended to Ascension 6 just for the energy because she gets ER Ascension, and there's a lot of teams where she's pretty ER hungry, is gonna all help a lot. Speaking of energy, one really nice thing about these Mualani teams is that, one, you have double Hydro, so you're getting additional sets of particles for Mona, and two, this rotation
Let me scrap light up a blazing sun. Try and stop the fate is upon you.
ends up on Mona when her skill explodes. So she actually gets to catch her own particles, which she doesn't really get to do in any team currently. And by the way, you don't need main stats on Song of Days Past, because main stats don't increase healing. The only thing that increases healing is your healing bonus, which is from the 2-piece and from your main stat on the circlet, but you can go off piece on that. And then all you care about is just having enough ER to burst every rotation, but that doesn't tend to be too hard. So it's not even like you need to go out of your way to farm a bunch of Song of Days Past. Like, get yourself either an ER Sands or a healing bonus circlet on Song of Days Past, and you're done. We can also go show what happens to the auras for this team against an enemy that isn't Hydro. Anyways.
Delves into pyroclastic surge. Full throttle. Decided by destiny. Anemo test 63. Let's ride. Surf's up. Let's shred.
Alright, when you have your burst, you do this.
Let me scribe. Wrath from the sky. Try and stop fate is upon
And you just repeat that. My Mualani is not currently geared, by the way, which is why the damage... Oh yeah, and by the way, right, like, you saw that I got my burst back on Mona, no problem. This is 156 ER Mona. I have a leveled healing bonus off piece, and then I have +0, +4 pieces, and it's still enough energy. Oh yeah, so I'm not going to do the N4 this time, so that I don't, because the N4 doesn't extend duration until the buffs happen.
Delves into pyroclastic surge. Written in the stars. Stand clear. Let's ride.
Right, and as you can see, we can get 500k there. Our buff fell off for that burst, but it was 600k. With the buff, it would have been much higher. But you'll get 3 of those at basically that number. Also, Pyro MC is not far behind Mawika here. Pyro MC has no personal damage, but just in terms of personal DPS on Mualani, Mualani actually does a bit more with Pyro MC, because the buff you get from Pyro MC is a bit lower than the buff you get from Mawika, but you get shorter rotations if you use Sack Pyro MC.
Let me scribe. Decided by destiny. Absorption test. Carving waves.
Oops, my solve didn't work. Whatever. Obviously, keep in mind, right, I didn't have Omen for a single one of my chomps here because we don't have the Omen buff yet, but you'll be able to make things work with Pyro MC, no problem, if you don't have Mawika. Now, those teams are below, because Maika does have personal damage in this team because you evade the burst. But they're not that much worse, and I think that's really nice for, you know, relatively newer players. Anyways, I've talked a lot about Mualani, almost to the point that this is Mualani witchcrafting more than Mona, but there's a reason for that. It's good. Other than Mualani, you can also use Mona as the on-field driver for off-field carries. You can do it for Durin, although, like I mentioned earlier quickly, Durin's on-field teams tend to be a little bit better, but that isn't to say that the off-field Durin teams with driver Mona are bad. They're still pretty good. But you can also do it for other characters. You can do like quick swappy with Mona or Lakino. You can do off-field Pyro infused Yahuda with Inefa Mona. You've got some cool options. I'll talk more about the Yahuda stuff in the Yahuda pre-release, so you can look forward to that as usual. If you don't want to miss it, you can subscribe. But yeah, as usual, I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned a thing or two, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.